Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Amidst Hashem Daf Mem Zayin Amid Aleph and I hope Daf Mem Zayin Amid Beis as well. So we have our work cut out for us. Sorry for missing the share last night. It was unavoidable, but we will try to make up for it tonight. But because we have a lot to do, we have to get started. I hope that all the noise in the background, I'm recording this on July 4th, and outside my window, it sounds a little bit like Ukraine with, I have so much fireworks going on in the background. I don't know if it's coming out on the recording or not. I certainly hope that it is not. So, we are holding on the very top line and the very first word of Mem Zayin Amid Aleph in Siman Lamed Beis in the midst of Sif Yud Ches. Very first word, Mem Zayin Amid Aleph, V'reish Sha'asa Kimin Dalet. But before we begin with this case of the Mechabers, I need to give a little bit of background so that we can understand properly the halachos that we're going to see today. So, I have to take you back to Mem Vav Amid Aleph in Sif Yud Zayin. Mem Vav Amid Aleph, the bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch in Sif Yud Zayin, the Mechaber gives us a case. He says, V'hu hadin im ta v'kasav dalid b'makom reish. Now, what does this mean? The Sefer made a mistake, and he was supposed to write a reish. So let's say the Sefer was writing the word ukeshartam, vav, kuf, shin, reish. He wrote the vav, he wrote the kuf, he wrote the shin, and now, instead of writing a reish, he made a mistake, and he wrote a dalid. But he wrote a real dalid, a bona fide dalid. And then after he wrote it, he looked and he said, Oy vey, what did I just do? I wrote ukeshadit. I wrote ukeshadeh instead of ukeshar. I wrote a dalid instead of a reish. What do you do? So the Mechaber said, what do you do? If you turn to Mem Vav Amid Beis on the top line, the Mechaber says, Ein takana limchay katag l'sakin ois. It would not be an eitzah to erase what the Mechaber calls the tag. Now, when the Mechaber says the tag, what he means is the extra ink. Here we have a dalid. Now, here's a dalid, and here's a reish. What's the difference between the dalid and the reish, essentially? It's the extension of the gag, where it goes past the regel. That's what the Mechaber is calling the tag. So the Mechaber says, you wrote a dalid instead of writing a reish? You can't just go ahead and take your X-Acto knife and scrape away that extra ink and by virtue of that, turn it into a reish. You can't do that. And we learned the reason you can't do it is because that would be chayk teichos. That would mean that you're forming the reish not by ksiva. You're not writing a reish. What you're doing is you wrote a dalid, and by scraping away extra ink, by doing chakika, by doing engraving, you're creating a reish. So the Mechaber said that you cannot do that. That would be puzzle. Mishum dehevik echak teichos. Now, if we take a look in the Mishnah Berurah on Mem Vav Amid Beis, in the top line of the Mishnah Berurah, so that's in middle of Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Samach Zayin. Okay, again, it's on Mem Vav Amid Beis, top line of the Mishnah Berurah, right by the Ois Katan Ayin Beis for the Sharat Tzion. The Chavetz Chaim says, okay, you cannot turn the dalid into a reish by scraping away that extra ink. Ein takana, you can't do that. So what should you do? So says the Mishnah Berurah, or rather, what should you do? Yigrar gamkein ktsas meha ois. When you scrape away at the dalid, you cannot simply scrape away the extra ink, right? You can't simply scrape away the extra ink of the extension of gag. No. El yigrar gamkein ktsas meha ois. You have to scrape away part of the letter itself, ad shelo yisha'er tzurasai olav, until you scrape away enough of the dalid that the dalid no longer has the tzuras ha'ois. It no longer looks like a dalid. So you're mevatel the tzuras ha'ois, v'achar kach yisaknenu, and then you could fix it. So let's encapsulate this halacha. What is this halacha? You wrote the wrong ois. You wrote a dalet instead of a resh. You might think that there's an easy way to fix it. Scrape away the extra ink that makes it a dalet as opposed to a resh. Now you have a resh. Says the Mechaber, that's no good. That's chok toichos. That's creating a resh by chakika, not by ksiva. So says the Mishnah Berurah, what should you do? You scrape away not only the extra ink, you scrape away, you erase enough of the dalid so that it no longer has tzuras ha'ois. You mavatal the tzuras ha'ois. Once you mavatal the tzuras ha'ois, so what are you left with? It's not a letter anymore. Now, if you go ahead and you take a kolmus and you dip it into ink and you make it into a dalid, to a resh, now you made a resh through ksiva, and that's kosher. So what the takeaway from here at this moment is, it sounds like you wrote the wrong ice, you wrote a dalet instead of a resh, now you want to turn it back into a resh, you need to turn it into a resh through ksiva, and the way to do that is erase enough of the letters so you mavatal tzuras ha'ois, it's no longer a dalet, and then write it into a resh. So now you created a resh through ksiva. That's what we have over here in the Mishnah Berurah. Now, later on Mem Vav Amid Beis, in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Samaches, the Mishnah Berurah said, the Mechaber says, Ein takana. You can't go fix this dalet and make it a resh by scraping away the ink. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Pirush. What does that mean, Ein takana? There's no way to fix it. What it means is Ayidei HaMechika. You can't fix it by simply erasing extra ink. Ein takana. Ava, what could you do? Another eitzah. Mutter lahoisif tiyai v'lasoisai ogoy. There's another way that you could turn a dalid into a resh. And you know what that is? If I would take a pen and I would fill in underneath the dalid, I'll do it right now. Ta-da! Look what I just did. I filled in more ink. I filled in underneath the extension where the gag went past the regel, and I turned it into a resh. Says the Chavetz Chaim, that's okay. Mutter lahisiv tiyai v'lasoisai ogoil. You could fill in the ink and round off the top corner of the resh, and now again, you changed a dalet into a resh, but you did it through ksiva. That's okay. So far, we have two ways to fix the problem. You wrote a dalet, you needed a resh. One way you could fix it is erase enough of the dalet that you mavatal tzuras ha'ois, and then make it into a resh. So you made it into a resh through ksiva. Another way you could fix it is just fill in ink to make it from a dalet into a resh. Again, you made it a resh through ksiva. That's okay. All right. Then we had later on, also on Mem Vav Amid Beis, in Sif Yud Ches, we had an interesting case. We had the case of a mem. Now, a mem, we are told, is really a construction of two letters. Now, the mem happens to be a letter that's a little tricky for me to make. So it's not going to be a beautiful mem. Okay, I wrote this a little small, but you can see here, this looks, let me make it bigger. I'm sorry, let me make it a little bigger. You see this? This looks a little bit like a nun, right? Looks like a nun. The first step in writing a regular mem is to make that nun. The second step in making a mem is essentially to make a vav. You see, now, what I did was, I made essentially a vav. Let me see if I could brighten it up a little bit so you can see better. Now what I did essentially over here was I attached a vav to the nun that I had previously made. Here's the nun. And now on the face, I attached a vav. And that's what turned this into a mem. Now the case that the Mechaber discusses is, you can see in the mem, it's a little hard to see in the picture, but between the bottom of the vav and the bottom of the nun, there's a gap. The Mechaber discusses, what if that gap became closed? If the gap became closed, now it's no longer a regular mem. Now the whole thing is closed, it's almost like an end mem. The Mechaber said, in that case, what you need to do to fix it is you have to remove the entire vav and rewrite that vav. You have to erase the entire vav at the front of the mem and rewrite it. Now, let's analyze that for a minute. In the case where you wrote a dalit and you needed a reish, we said what you have to do is you have to erase enough of the dalit so that you're mevatel the tzura. You're mevatel the tzura of the dalit. Then you could turn it into a reish, and we say it's a kosher reish because you made the reish through ksiva. By this mem, we see something new. It's not enough to simply erase part of the mem and be mevatel the tzura. No, you have to remove the entire vav and rewrite the vav. And the Mishnah Berurah explained why. Because the Mishnah Berurah introduced us to a new problem. And that's a problem that we're going to discuss today in greater detail. I told you that there's two steps in making the mem. The first step was to make a nun. Now, when you made that nun, you did a perfect job. So the nun was made bekashrus. Then you made the vav. When you made the vav, you klutzed, and you attached the bottom of the vav to the bottom of the nun, so that you closed off the mem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that means that the vav was made bipsul. Since the vav was made bipsul, we have to erase the entire vav and rewrite the vav. Now the nun is fine. The nun aspect of the mem is fine. That was written bekashrus. And when you erase the entire vav, you are being mevatel the tzura of the mem. So you erase the vav and rewrite the vav bekashrus. But would it be enough, let's say, to erase the bottom half of the mem and then rewrite it so that I was mevatel the tzura of the mem and I recreated the mem through ksiva? No, that wouldn't be okay. You know why? Because the part of the vav that you left is no good because it was written bipsol. So this is a new problem. This is not a chok teichos problem. This is a problem that there was part of the letter that was written bipsol. Now, with that understanding, let's learn the first halacha on Mem Zayin Amid Aleph, and right away we're going to have a kasha, and I'll answer the kasha for you. I'm sorry again if all this noise from outside is interrupting the recording. You have no idea what's going on over here. So, says the Mechaber, top line, Mem Zayin Amid Aleph. V'reish she'asa'a kimin dalid. And I have a picture over here. Let's say the Sefer went to write a reish. But when he wrote the reish, he slipped up. And he made a reish that looks like a dalid. But he didn't make a dalid. You see, when you make a dalid, making a dalid is a two-step affair. When you make a dalid, what you do is you make a gag, right? That's one swipe of the pen. One swipe of the pen is to make the gag. Then you take the pen off the cloth, and then you make a regel. That's how you make a dalid. When you make a reish is done in one swipe of the pen. You start over here, you go there, and you go down. One swipe of the pen makes a reish. So a dalid is two steps. A gag, and then a regel. A reish is one step, just like that. Now, what the Sefer did in this case was, he did it in one motion of the pen. But he went a little too far on the gag, and then he came back with the pen and went down. So his reish came out like a dalid. But he didn't make a dalid. Says the Mechaber, V'reish sha'asa kimin dalid. If you made a reish that came out like a dalid, now, if we would stop right over there, and I would ask you, what do you have to do? I think what you would answer me is, well, Rabbi Weiss, we saw on the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Aleph in Sif Yud Zayin that if the Sefer wrote a Dalet instead of a Reish, what does he have to do? He has to erase enough of the Dalet so he's Mavatal the Tzura, and then he can take the pen and recreate a Dalet. So over here, I would think, if the Sefer wrote a Reish and it came out like a Dalet, I would think, take a razor, scratch away enough of the letter so that you're Mavatal Tzura Sa'ois, and then fix it and make a Dalet. Says the Mechaber, no. V'reish sha'asa kimin Dalet. If you made a reish that came out like a Dalet, says the Mechaber, yesh lahachmir. You should be machmir. You should be stringent. V'loimar. And you should say, Deloi sagi, it's not enough. K'sheyigrar hayorech. To scrape away the leg of the reish levad. Oy hagag levad. Or to erase the top of the reish alone. V'yachzar v'yichtevenu kimin reish. And then fix it and make it a reish. That's not enough. Now, I want you to understand something. If you made a reish that looked like a dalet, and then you took a razor and you erased the leg, were you mavatal the tzuras ha'os? Yeah, you are. Or, if you take a razor and you erase the gag of the reish, were you mavatal the tzuras ha'os? Certainly you are. Says the Mechaber, it doesn't matter. It's not enough. You should be machmir. You wanted to write a reish, and your reish came out looking like a dalet. It's not enough to erase the yarech, the leg, or to erase the gag. Not enough. Continues the Mechaber. Why not? Mishum de bein hagag u bein hayarech nasu bepisel. Because when you wrote the gag of that reish, or you wrote the leg of that reish, it was made bipsul. You were trying to make a reish. Did you make a reish? No. You made something that looks like a dalet. Is it a kosher reish? No, it's not a kosher reish. Is it a dalet? You didn't go to make a dalet. You didn't make a gag and a yerech. You went like that. That's not a dalet. You made a reish that looks a little bit like a dalet. And it looks too much like a dalet, so it's not a kosher reish. It's not a reish. It doesn't have the tzuras ha'os of a reish. But it's also not a dalet. So all of it was made bipsul. Hilkach, therefore, says the Mechaber, tzarich ligrar shnehem. You have to erase the entire gag, and you have to erase the entire leg. So I want to contrast this halacha on the top of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph to the halacha on the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Aleph. On the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Aleph, the Sofer was supposed to write a reish. Ukeshartam. Vav Kuv Shin Reish. He was supposed to write a reish. He klutzed up. And he wrote a dalet. Intentionally. He wrote a dalet. And he wrote a beautiful dalet, a kosher dalet. Then he realized he has a mistake. He wrote a dalet instead of a reish. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what's the eitzah? The Chavetz Chaim says the eitzah is erase enough of the dalet so that you mevatel tzuras ha'os. So I don't care what part of the dalet you erase. You could erase the gag of the dalet. You could erase the leg of the dalet. You could erase half of the leg, half of the gag. Well, maybe then you would have a yud. Erase enough of the ois so that you're mevatel tzuras ha'os, and then turn it into a reish. That's okay. That's the halacha on Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Here on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, we have a very, very similar case. The Sofer wanted to write a reish, but his reish came out funny. His reish came out looking like a dalet. What's the eitzah? Could you erase enough of it to be mevatel tzuras ha'os and then make it into a reish? No. Chaver says you can't do that. You can't just erase the yerech. That would be mevatel tzuras ha'os. You can't just erase the gag. That would be mevatel tzuras ha'os. No, that's not enough. Why? because it was made bipsul. Therefore, you have to erase the whole thing and rewrite the reish. What's the difference between these two halachas? In the first halacha, you wrote a daled instead of a reish. So how come you don't have to erase the whole daled? Why is it that over there it's enough to be mevatel tzuras ha'os, and over here it's not? The answer is that on Mem Vav Amid Aleph, the Sefer wrote a daled. He wrote a kosher daled. There's not supposed to be a daled here. There's supposed to be a reish. That's not nase bipsol. The problem is that you need a reish. And you need a reish that's created through ksiva. You can't have a reish that's created through chakika. So you can't just scrape away the extra ink and make it a reish. You need to write a reish. In order to write a reish out of what was a daled, first you have to make it ois daled. How do you make it ois daled? By being mevatel tzuras ois. So you have to scrape away enough of the daled so that you mevatel tzuras ois, and then make it a reish through ksiva. Now you have a kosher reish through ksiva. You're okay. But that doesn't work here on Mem Zayin Amid Aleph. On Mem Zayin Amid Aleph, you did not write a kosher daled. You went to write a reish. Your reish, you didn't go to write a daled. You went to write a reish. Your reish came out funny. So you didn't make a daled and you didn't make a reish. So what is it? It's Chinese. So is that a ksiva tama? No, it's not a ksiva tama. It's not a daled, it's not a reish. So it's not nasa bekashrus. In the first case, you made a daled. And you made a daled bekashrus. But you don't need a daled. So be mevatel tzuras ha'os, make it a reish. In this case, you can't use any of what you wrote because it wasn't nasa bekashrus. You wrote some kind of funny blob of ink. You wrote a reish that's not a reish, but it's also not a daled. So I don't know what it is. It's some kind of mark. So that's not a ksiv at all. You have to erase the whole thing, and you have to rewrite the reish. So a simple halacha, a seemingly simple halacha, that only has about 4 lines of Mishnah Berurah, and see how complicated it is. And I want to do 2 pages. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Mem Zayin Amid Aleph Ois Kat Ein Vav, V'reish, if you are writing a reish, but the reish came out funny, came out looking like a daled. Oy vav, or the Sefer went to write a vav, Shasoi kim in reish. He wanted to write a vav, but he made the top of the vav a little bit too long, and now it looks like a reish. V'chol kahai gavna shenasa b'ksiva achas, or any other kind of letter that's made with one motion of the pen. A reish is made with one motion of the pen. A vav is made with one motion of the pen. Ois kan ein zayin kim in daled. The reish came out looking like a daled. V'hu adin, the same halacha would apply begagay shel kaf pshuta if you extended the roof of an endechaf too long. Shasai rachav, you made it too wide. Ad shenira kedaled. So now the proportion of the roof of the endechaf and the leg of the endechaf makes it look like a daled or a reish or like a reish. V'ayin bebir halacha. V'asefer nechshalon bazeh ba'aviseinu harabim. So what's the point here? The point is a reish is made with one swipe of the pen. A vav is made with one swipe of the pen. You made a reish, it looks like a daled. You made a vav, it looks like a reish. You have to erase the whole thing. Because the whole thing was nase bipsul. You made a vav, but it didn't come out of vav. It came out looking like a reish. But you didn't make a reish, you made a vav. It's nase bipsul. And you can't only erase part of it, because it's made with one swipe of the pen. So the whole thing was made bipsul. So you have to erase the whole thing and rewrite it. This is different than the halach of the mem that we learned earlier. The mem is made with 2 swipes of the pen. It's a nun and then a vav. When you made the nun aspect of the mem was made bekashrus. So you don't have to erase it and rewrite it. It's only the vav aspect of the mem that you have to erase and rewrite. Wow. Continues the mechaber. 3 lines down, beginning of the line. V'im nidbaka ois la'ois. Let's say you wrote 2 letters in the Tefillin, and they came out touching each other. Now the problem when 2 letters touch each other is they're not mukaf gevil. They're not completely surrounded by blank parchment. V'im nidbaka ois la'ois. If 2 letters become connected, bein kaidim sheti gamer. whether they got in contact with each other before you finished writing them, or maybe you finished writing both letters perfectly, and then somehow they got connected. They're puzzle, because they're not mukaf kvil. V'im garar v'hifrida. In that case, if you take an X-Acto knife and you separate the two letters, kosher. That's kosher. V'loy mikri chak toiches. That does not have the psul of chak toiches. Why? Says the Mechaber, me'achar sheha'ois atzma hoisa ksuva kitikuna. Because in this case, the two letters were written perfectly, and they're completely recognizable. So I'll show you over here on my thing over here, right? Let's say we had two letters. Let's say this was a dalet or a resh. I made it look like a resh now, and there's a resh over here. Let's say something happened. I was moving my pen, and some ink dripped, and now they're touching each other. See that line? They're touching each other. Well, now it's a problem because they're not mukaf gvil. And this is a problem even if it happened after I wrote both letters. So I wrote this letter perfectly, I wrote this letter perfectly. They were both mukaf gvil, but now they became connected, so now they're not mukaf gvil. Over here, all I have to do is take my X-Acto knife and scrape away the connecting line. Why don't we say it's chak toiches? Now you're creating these two letters by scraping something away. No, I'm not. The two letters are perfectly recognizable. They're perfectly intact. They're perfectly here. The problem only is that they're touching each other. But they're both very fully recognizable, and they're both formed perfectly. So I'm not creating the letters by scraping away the connecting line. I'm just making it kosher by scraping away the connecting line, because I take away the problem of mukaf gvil. That's not a psul of chak toiches. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut 9 ches. The Mechaber said that this psul of mukaf gvil is whether the two letters became connected before you finished writing them or after you finished writing them. Shenigmara ha'ois ba'arkai karai, the letter was formed in its full length properly. Kigoin, for example, shekasav tevas loy. You wrote the word loy, lamid vav. V'nidbak vav b'katzeu la'lamid. And the vav, the bottom of the vav, became connected to the bottom of the lamid. Some ink dripped, and it became connected. Or anything like that. Even if they're just contacting each other with a drop of ink. So the lamid is perfectly recognizable, the vav is perfectly recognizable, it's still puzzle. It's still puzzle. Why? Because in order for the tefillin to be kosher, every letter has to be fully surrounded by blank parchment. Let's say you have a problem where you're using loose ink. The ink that you're using is a little too liquidy, or the parchment is a little too absorbent. So when you write, the ink spreads. So, says the Mishnah Berurah, if the letters swell up, the ink spreads. Because of the wetness, the looseness of the ink. Shekarin giflossen. In Yiddish, that was called giflossen. Ad shenirin kidvukin. Until two letters that are next to each other, they got so close to each other that they look like they're connected. But nevertheless, nira, you could see if you look closely, that there is some space there. Kosher. It's kosher because it's mukaf gvil. But on the other hand, if the letters do touch each other, even though they came into contact with each other after each letter was fully written, Even Ezer b'Siman Kuf Chavei Sif Tezayin b'Hagah b'Beit Shmuel Ayin Sham. V'Ayin Le'el b'Bir Halacha b'Sif Sif Tezayin v'Mnitz Dibuk b'Neis La'is Kishayitziu Sefer Torah L'Kriya. If you find two letters that are touching each other when you take out a Sefer Torah to lay in from, Ayin L'Kaman b'Siman Kuf b'Em Gimel b'Bir Halacha. We're not going to discuss that now beyond the scope of the shir. Ois Katan Ayin Tes Kosher. If the two letters came into contact with each other, so you took a razor and you scraped away ink to separate them one from the other, kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah, for who adin the same halacha applies, im raglei ha'oisiyos, if the legs of two letters, oigagon, or the roof of two letters, ve'emtsa'an, or the middle of two letters. Magia l'soif, reach the end of the parchment. Bali hekif plaf. If you write all the way to the edge of the parchment, so that section of the letter that touches the edge of the parchment is not mukaf kvil. It's not surrounded by blank parchment because it's all the way to the edge. Rashoy ligror ktsas. You can fix it by taking a razor and scraping a little bit away so that there's room between the edge of the letter and the edge of the parchment. Deloy gara, that's not a chok toiches problem. Deloy gara, because that's no worse than the case of two letters coming into contact with each other, to mahani grira, where we say that scraping away is okay. It's not considered chok toiches. Vedan, you should know the bazeh ein ma'akiv shaloi kisidron. With these types of problems, we have two letters contacting each other. So you'll say, the Sefer wrote, Kadesh Li. And then the Lamed and the Yud touched each other. Then he wrote Kol Bechar. Then he sees that the Lamed and the Yud from Li are touching each other, but the Lamed is perfectly recognizable and the Yud is perfectly recognizable. So he takes a razor and he scrapes it apart. Why is it not a problem of Shaloi Kisidron? No, because the problem of Shaloi Kisidron is when you write the letters or the word Shaloi Kisidron. But over here, the Lamed and the Yud and everything that came after it was written perfectly in order. There's a technical problem that they're not Mukaf Gvil. Taking away the problem of Mukaf Gvil does not create a problem of Shaloi Kisidron. Because it's not the ksiva of the ice. You're not writing part of the ice Shaloi Kisidron. The letters are fully there. Kisidron. You're just scraping away ink. Even if this happens in the Shem Hashem, if two letters of the Shem Hashem became connected at their bottoms, you could erase the ink and separate them. Ice pay, this is not a problem of chok toiches. Umayri, but of course, we're talking about cases shaloi nishtane ha'ois mitzurasa ayidei advekus. When we say if two letters come into contact each other, you could fix it by scraping away ink and it's not a chok toiches problem. That's only if the form of the letter, the tzuras ha'ois, was not changed by virtue of the fact that they came into contact with each other. Aval, however, im nishtane sa'ois mitzurasa, if the letter lost its proper form by virtue of it becoming connected to another letter, the ein atinok yakal ekroisa, to the extent that its atinok would not be able to recognize it as the proper letter, the cholshken, and certainly im nishtanes lutzuras ois acheres, or if by virtue the two letters became connected, it now looks like a different letter. Kigoyin, for example, a very interesting case. Vav shenidbak b'soifai lenun kefufa. A very interesting case. Let me see if I can draw it for you. You have a vav. Okay. Here you have a vav, and next to it you have a regular nun. No problem. Now let's say they became connected. Kigon vav shenidbak b'soifai, a vav that became connected at its end, at its bottom, linun kifufa, to a regular bent nun. A nun kefufa is in contrast to a nun pshuta, a straight nun. What's a straight nun? An end nun. A nun kefufa is a regular nun, a bent nun. And they got connected with a dibuk av, with a thick connection. Show you what that means. Okay, now I connected the vav and the nun next to it with a thick connection at the bottom over here. What letter does that look like, Rabbi Isai? This mirror image thing always throws me off. If I cover that up, what does this look like? Guess what? It looks like a tes. See that? If I take my finger away and you see the bottom of the nun, it doesn't look so much like a tes. But if I cover up the bottom of the nun, you see very clearly a tes. So says the Mishnah Berurah, let's say you had a vav and a nun that got connected with a thick connection at the bottom, shenires kitzuras tes, so that it looks like a tes. Until, if you would show it to a child who's not too sharp and not too slow, he would call it a tes. Then scraping away the connection would not help, because that would be chak teichos. That would be creating a vav and a nun from a tes. This would be like the case we had earlier of the regular mem, shenistama, that got closed so that it looks like an endemem, and then you scraped it apart, umikvi chak teichos. Therefore, tzarich ligrar gam nun, you would have to erase the vav and the nun, shegamu nishtanim itzurasai, because now they both became a different tzura, they lost the tzuras ha'is, v'nifsal al yedei adibuk, and they became puzzled through the connection, v'chein kol kiyotze b'zeh. So just to re-encapsulate what the halacha that we just had over here, the Mechaber said, if two letters became touching to one another, you had the word loy, lamid vav, and a little thin line connected the bottom of the lamid to the lamid of the vav. But the lamid is fully recognizable as a lamid. The vav is fully recognizable as a vav. You could fix this by just taking a razor and scraping away the connection. And it's not chak teichos. Why is it chak teichos? Because you didn't create a lamid through scraping away the connection. You didn't create a vav by scraping away the connection. The lamid was there, the vav was there. You're just taking away the technical problem of the letters not being mukaf gvil. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, in the case like he just gave you, where you have a vav and a nun next to each other, and they got connected in such a way where you no longer have a vav and a nun. Now you have a tes, then you can't fix it by just scraping away the connection. Because now you're creating a vav and a nun through chak teichos. Ois cotton pei aleph in the Mishnah Berurah. The reason this isn't chak teichos, said the Mechaber, is me'achar shah ois atzma hoisa ksuva ketikuna. Because the letters, like the case of the lamed and the vav, with a small connection at the bottom, the lamed is fine, the vav is fine. So you're not creating the letters through chak teichos. They're already written ketikuna, properly. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Kap Pei Aleph, ubenafla tipas dioi besif yod zayin. In the case we had in sif yod zayin, where a drop of ink fell inside a letter, like a drop of ink filled up the inside of a pay. We said you can't fix it by scraping away that ink. After nichtava b'tchila ketikuna, why don't you say the same thing? Why don't you say, what do you mean? I had a beautiful pay. I wrote a beautiful pay. Then ink fell in. Why can't I just scrape away the ink and leave the pay? No. Niskalkala yedei atipa ve'ein ikeres. Because in that case, if a drop of ink fills up the inside of the pay, you lost the tzura of the pay. Now by scraping away the ink, you're trying to recreate the tzura of the pay. That's chak teichos. Masha'en kein bazeh. Contrast that to our case. Da'afilu kaidem agrira, even before you scrape away the connection, nikar heitev kol ois b'fnei atzma. Each letter is fully recognizable. Well, if he's there, according to this, im kol oirech ha'ois tevuka lechaverta. Let's say you would have two letters that are mamish fully touching each other along their whole connection. Mamish, they're not just touching each other with a little line. They're mamish touching each other so that you don't have the tzuras ha'is. Like mahani greira. Then just scraping it apart with a razor, taka wouldn't work. It would be chak teichos. Okay, it's already 40 minutes, but let's go weiter. I still want to try to knock off Amid Beis as well. We go to the bottom line of the Mechaber here, Mem Zayin Amid Aleph, the last three words. Another case. Im nogu raglei hahei v'hakuf bagag. Let's say the little foot of a hay was touching the roof of the hay. I'm going to make that for you right now. I already made it, but I have to remake it. You'll see why in a second. Okay. Here we have a hay. Okay, so the hay has the little regel over here. Let's say the little regel of the hay became connected to the gag of the hay, like you could see over here. Here's the regel of the hay, but the Sefer was writing it and he dripped some ink, and now the left-hand regel of the hay is touching the gag of the hay. Or let's say over here, you have a kuf. The kuf also has a regel. That regel actually looks like a nun pshuta, looks like an end of nun. Let's say the top of that regel came into contact with the top of the kuf. In both of these cases, they're not supposed to be touching. The regel of the hay is supposed to be open to the gag, and the regel of the kuf is supposed to be open to the gag of the kuf. Let's say they became touching. So again, the Mechaber said, last few words of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, Im nagu raglei hay v'hakuf bagag. If the small foot of the hay or the foot of the kuf became connected to the roof of the hay or the kuf, yigrar haregel, you have to erase the entire regel, the yachzor v'yichtevenu, and then you have to rewrite it. You can't just take a razor and scrape away the connection. You have to erase the entire foot and rewrite the entire foot. Why? I'll tell you why. The reason is like this. What are you going to do? If the regel of the hay is connecting the gag, to just take a razor and scrape away the connection, now you're making a hay through halachos. Because as long as the regel is touching the top of the hay, that's not the tzura of the hay. So you don't have the tzuras ois. By scraping it away, the connection, now you made the tzuras ois of a hay. But that means you made the tzuras ois of a hay through chakika, not through ksiva. So that's halachos. So that you cannot do. What you have to do is, you have to erase the entire regel of the hay. Now, why do you have to erase the entire regel? The reason you have to erase the entire regel is because the entire regel was nasa b'psul. So you have to erase the entire regel and make a new regel. But, continues the Mechaber, top line, Mem Zayin Amud Beis, ve'ein tzarich ligrar kol ha'ois. But you don't have to erase the entire letter. So let's say by the hay. The hay is comprised of a dalid, right? The hay is comprised of a dalid and the regel. So you have to erase the entire regel. But you could leave the dalid. Why? Because the dalid was nasa b'kashrus. You wrote the dalid perfectly kosher. And you were writing it as part of a hay. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the dalid aspect of the hay. It's just the regel that's a problem. The regel was nasa b'psul because it was touching the gag. So you have to erase the entire regel and rewrite the regel. But the dalid aspect of the hay is fine. Ki hagag kadin nechtav. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's cut in Pei Gimel. Ha-hay. No, we go back to Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. Bottom line of the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Pei Beis. Im nagu. If the regel of the hay or the regel of the kuf was touching the gag. Avalim yesh hefsik dak. But even if there's the tiniest gap between the regel and the gag, I feel a rak chut asayra. Even if it's just a hair. Kosher, it's kosher. Pei Gimel ha-hay. We're talking about the little regel of a hay. Afim nidbak rak chut asayra. Even if the regel is only touching the gag with the tiniest little drip of ink. And if a child would look at it, he would instantly recognize it as a hay. You still have to erase the entire regel of that hay and rewrite it. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah, if the letter was not written properly, if it does not have the tzuras ha'ois, the form of the letter as we were makabelit from Moshe Misinai, ein shem oisalav. It's not a hay. I don't care if a tinuk reads it like a hay. If the regel of the hay is touching the gag, it doesn't have the tzuras ha'ois of a hay. So it's not a hay, even if the tinuk calls it a hay. V'chein b'kuf. Same thing with the kuf. If the regel of the kuf is touching the gag of the kuf, I don't care if a tinuk reads it as a kuf. It's not the tzuras ha'ois of a kuf. The tzuras ha'ois of a kuf is that the regel is separate from the body. Loimahani kriyas atinoik. Ois cotton pei dalid. In these cases, yigrar, you have to erase the entire regel. V'loimahani afroda ba'alma. You can't just scrape away the point of connection. You have to erase the entire regel. Why? Because if you scrape away just the connection, that's creating the tzuras ha'is of a hay or the tzuras ha'is of a kuf through chak teichais. You can't do that. So again, let's contrast two cases. If you wrote a lamid and a vav, you wrote the word loy, and the lamid and the vav became connected to each other at the bottom, you could fix it by scraping away the connection. Chak teichais? No, because you have a perfect lamid and you have a perfect vav. They're just connected slightly. But the lamid is a tzuras ha'is of a lamid, the vav is a tzuras ha'is of a vav. Scrape away the connection, it's fine. But if you have a hay where the regel is touching the top, that's not tzuras ha'is of a hay. So you can't make a hay by just scraping away the point of connection. You have to erase the entire regel that was written b'psol, and you have to write a new regel that's disconnected from the gag and create a hay through ksiva. Pay, ice cut and pay hay. You have to erase the regel. Haregel pirish kuloi, the entire regel. Bein behay, bein bekuf. Whether we're talking about the little regel of the hay or the regel of the kuf that looks like a nun seifis. Kevet shenasa b'psol. Vayin b'bir halacha. Okay, next halacha of the mechaber. The last three words on the top line of Mem Zayin and Beis. Im naga regel ha'alif begag ha'alif. If the foot of the aleph was touching the body of the aleph, what does this mean? Here we have an aleph. The middle piece of the aleph is called the guf, the body of the aleph, or the gag, the roof of the aleph. This yud is called the regel of the aleph. Says the Mechaber, naga regel ha'aleph begag ha'aleph. If the regel of the aleph was touching the gag of the aleph. Now the regel of the aleph is always touching the gag of the aleph. I'll make a simple stick figure aleph just to make this readily recognizable, and I'll make it very big. Okay, here we have an aleph. This is the regel. The regel is always touching the body. It's supposed to touch the body. So what's the problem over here? What are we talking about over here? So says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and pay vav. It's cut and pay vav. Begaga aleph. The regel of the aleph is touching the roof of the aleph. De'ein lahayud ha'elyoin va'atachtoin liga b'hagag, because the upper yud and the lower yud of the aleph are not supposed to touch the guf of the aleph, says the Mishnah Berurah. Ela b'dakush shebehem. They're only supposed to be touching with the thin line. This is a yud, and there's a thin line that touches it to the body. This is an upside down yud, and there's a thin line that touches it to the body. So the Mishnah Berurah says, the upper yud and the lower yud of the aleph are only supposed to touch the gag, the main body of the aleph, only with a fine, thin line. But that's not what happened over here. The case of the mechaber, what happened is, instead of just touching the aleph with a thin line, instead, what happened is, you got something that looks like this. You got something that looks like this. Now it's touching the gag with a thick line. And this is touching the gag with a thick line. It's almost as if, you see over here in this aleph, which is written the way it's supposed to be, you have a yud attached to the gag with a thin line. You have an upside down yud attached to the gag with a thin line. But here, you have a thick thing, a thick regel touching the gag. and a thick top touching the gag. So let's see it inside of the mechaber. Im naga regel aleph begag aleph. If the foot of the aleph is touching the gag, the central portion of the aleph, with a thick line, or continues the mechaber, penei ha'aleph. The penei ha'aleph is a reference to the upper yud. The penei ha'aleph is touching the body of the aleph bifnim, on its inside, bagag shetachteha, on the roof that's beneath it. I'm going to try to quickly write this very large so you can understand what he means when he says bifnim. Okay, this is how the upper yud is supposed to touch the gag, with a thin line. But what if it became filled in bifnim, on the inside, meaning the inside of this yud, not in here, not in the rosh, but inside over here. This is inside of the yud. It became filled in, so that now it's like this. Okay? That's what he means. Oy penei ha'aleph, or the top yud of the aleph, bifnim bagag shetachteha, got filled in on the inside and came into contact with the gag that lies beneath it. In both of these cases, says the mechaber, puzzle, the letter is puzzle, ve'ein takana begrira lahafrida, and you cannot fix it by scraping away that extra ink and separating it. Why? To have a HaTorah, because again, that is a problem of a HaTorah. Ella, rather, what do you have to do? Yigrar kol ma shenaseh b'pisol. The entire part of the aleph that was written b'psol has to be erased and rewritten. So if the way you wrote the aleph was you wrote the gag of the aleph, the main central portion, then you wrote this yud badly and you connected it to the aleph badly, so then this was written b'psol. Since it was written b'psol, you have to erase the entire thing and rewrite it b'kashrus. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Pevav, Begaga Aleph, the Ein La Yuda El Yom Atach, the Liga Bagaga, the Badaka Shebehem, we did this already. Kemoshe Yisparla Kamam, Mishnah Berurah, Siman Labad Vav, B'didi Sur Sais Yos. Pei Zayin, Penei HaAleph. What's the Penei HaAleph? Hainu Ayuda El Yoin, that's a reference to the upper Yud. V'hainu Dafka Shedidbaka Kula Shedipsa Tsurasa. The problem over here is that it got filled in with a thick, heavy line, so now you don't have the tzura. Avalim nispashit ma'at. But if the connection point of the upper yud of the aleph and the body of the aleph got a little bit thick, it spread a little bit. Ve'enoi dak karoi l'yofi aksiva. If the problem is just that where the upper yud is supposed to connect to the body, the line is not so thin, it got a little bit thick. But you still have the tsura of a yud connecting to the gag. You didn't lose the tsura, just it's not pretty. Im nishar hefresh, as long as you can still sense the separation, and bekach klum, that's not a problem. Veitzarch tikun, and you don't have to fix it even. Peches lahafrida, you can't just scrape away the ink in order to separate it. What does that mean to separate it? Pirish lahafrid is hanagia levada, so that you scrape away that area of heavy connection. V'yishayer ois memela karoi, and now the ois will remain over there memela. You can't do that. Instead, what do you have to do? Said the mechaber on the bottom line. Yigrar kol ma shenaseh b'psol. You have to erase the entire part of the aleph that was written b'psol. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu sheyigra haregel kuloi. If you wrote the yud first, and then you wrote the central portion, and you wrote the central portion in such a way that it's too heavily connected to the yud, then you have to erase the whole central portion. It's not enough to separate the regel from the body, just so that you don't have the tzur of an aleph anymore. because you wrote the regel of the Aleph B'Psula. Let's be rewritten. V'chein menidbak yud she'ala Aleph begat shetachtov. Tzarich ligrar kol hayod l'kasem echadash. V'yeshem achmirim menidbak hayud el yod be'es haksiva. There are those that are machmir, and they say that if the upper yud of the Aleph became overly connected to the main body of the Aleph at the time that you wrote it, there are those that are machmir ligrar kol ha'aleph avor zeh, to erase the entire Aleph. Ki memela nichtav achar kach shara ois b'psula al yidei zeh. Ach b'diavad tzarachin im yesh lahakmar b'zeh k'mosh kasafti b'bir halacha. And we will stop over here. So Baruch Hashem, we really did this page as well. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua Sefurus Parnasa Sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'Yisrael Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.